The police arrest that changed everything about me. The handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists at 2:47 in the morning, and in that single, cold, metallic sound, I heard the echo of every bad choice I had ever made collapsing in on itself all at once. The red and blue lights strobed across the wet pavement, painting the neighborhood in the colors of shame, and I remember thinking, not about my freedom, not about the charges, but about my mother's face when she would find out. That thought alone nearly buckled my knees right there on the sidewalk. My name is Marcus, and for the first 26 years of my life, I was convinced I was surviving. I wasn't. I was drowning in slow motion, and I had gotten so used to the feeling of sinking that I had mistaken it for floating. I grew up in a part of the city where ambition was considered dangerous. Not because the people around me were cruel, most of them were the kindest, most generous souls I've ever known, but because ambition required hope, and hope in that neighborhood had a way of getting beaten out of you early. My father left when I was 7, not dramatically, not with a fight or a farewell. He simply stopped coming home one day, and we adjusted the way you adjust to a missing tooth. You learn to chew around the absence. My mother worked 2 jobs and still came home each night to make sure there was something warm on the table and something soft in her eyes when she looked at me. And my younger sister, Diane, she was the strongest person I have ever known, and for a long time, I repaid that strength by making myself into her greatest burden. By the time I was 19, I had dropped out of high school, cycled through a string of jobs I quit out of pride or boredom, and fallen in with a group of men who called themselves my brothers, but who would scatter like smoke the moment things got serious. We weren't violent people, not exactly, but we lived in the margins of lawfulness, small hustles, shortcuts, favors that had prices attached to them that you only discovered later. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was smarter than the situation. I told myself this every single day for 7 years. And somewhere along the way, the telling became the only honest thing left about me. The night of my arrest began the way most disasters do, quietly, ordinarily, without any sense of what was coming. I was sitting in the passenger seat of a car belonging to a man I'll call Ray, because names have consequences and his story is not mine to tell fully. We had been asked to move something from one location to another, and I had asked no questions because asking questions in that world was considered a form of weakness. What we were moving turned out to be something that carried a felony charge, and the unmarked police car that had been following us for 11 blocks had known that long before we did. When the lights came on behind us and Ray pulled over, time did something strange. It stretched and compressed simultaneously. I remember the texture of the car door handle as I gripped it. I remember the sound of the officer's voice, firm and practiced, asking us both to step out slowly. I remember my own heartbeat, not racing but thunderously slow, like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. And then the handcuffs and that sound, that small mechanical click that somehow contained the weight of everything. I spent 2 nights in a holding cell before my arraignment. Those 48 hours were the most honest conversation I had ever had with myself, and I had not initiated it willingly. There was nothing to distract me, no phone, no noise I could manufacture, no hustle to run, just a narrow bench, a flickering fluorescent light, and the faces of men around me who looked exactly the way I felt. Not dangerous, not hardened, just tired, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I looked at the man across from me, maybe 50 years old, his eyes carrying decades of the same slow drowning I recognized in myself, and something shifted in my chest. It wasn't pity, it was terror, because I could see my future in his present, mapped out with horrifying clarity. My public defender was a young woman named Claire, and she was overwhelmed and underfunded and probably handling 30 cases that week, but she sat across from me in that consultation room and she looked at me, really looked at me, and she said something I have never forgotten. She said that the system she worked inside was broken in ways she couldn't fix, but that the decision of who I became next was still entirely mine, and that nobody, not a judge, not a record, not a neighborhood, could take that particular thing away from me unless I let them. She said it plainly, without drama, the way you might state a fact about the weather, and something about the simplicity of it reached me where speeches and warnings and pleading had never been able to. I was released on a plea arrangement that included community service, mandatory counseling, and a period of supervised probation. In the eyes of the law, I had been given a second chance. In my own eyes, standing outside the courthouse in the thin gray morning light, I didn't yet know what to do with it. My mother was waiting on the steps. She didn't rush toward me. She didn't cry, though I could see the shape of tears she had already spent written into the lines around her eyes. She simply opened her arms and I walked into them, and she held me the way she had held me when I was 7 years old and my father had disappeared. With a love so steady and so unearned that it was almost unbearable to receive. She didn't say I told you so. She didn't say anything at all for a long time. And that silence was the most powerful thing anyone has ever said to me. The months that followed were not cinematic. There was no single transformative moment, no musical swell, no sudden clarity that reorganized my life overnight. Real change, I was learning, doesn't arrive like lightning. It arrives the way light arrives in the early morning, so gradually that you can't name the exact moment darkness became something else. I showed up to my community service hours at a neighborhood rec center, expecting to resent every minute of it. Instead, I found myself working alongside a program coordinator named Dennis, a former teacher, who had given up a better-paying career to run after-school programs for kids in neighborhoods exactly like the one I came from. He was perpetually underfunded, perpetually cheerful, and perpetually operating with a faith in human potential that I found both irritating and magnetic. I started helping with the kids not because I was required to, but because somewhere in the third week, a 10-year-old boy named Jordan attached himself to me like I was the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask yet. He was small and serious and wore his loneliness like a coat he didn't know how to take off. I recognized him immediately. I recognized him the way you recognize your own handwriting, and something in me that had been sealed shut for years cracked quietly open. I began studying for my GED on the weekends. I started slowly, haltingly, convinced at first that I was too far behind, too old, too much of a certain kind of person to become a different kind. But Dennis lent me books without making a ceremony of it, and my counselor helped me understand that the story I had been telling myself about who I was had been authored largely by circumstances and partly by pain, and that authorship could be reclaimed. It was not easy. There were nights I sat over workbooks and felt a rage so pure it made my hands shake. Rage at the years wasted, at the opportunities missed, at the version of myself that had chosen small comfort over large possibility for so long. I let myself feel that rage. And then slowly I let it become fuel instead of fog. The day I passed my GED exam, I called my mother first. She cried in a way she had never let herself cry in front of me before. Openly, completely, with her whole body. And I understood then that her tears weren't just for that day. They were for every day she had held herself together, so I could fall apart safely. For every night she had prayed in the dark for a morning just like this one. If you've ever believed that kindness is weakness, or that asking for help means you've lost, I want you to know that I stood exactly where you're standing. I carried that belief like armor and it nearly destroyed me. What changed me wasn't a punishment, though the arrest was the rupture that made everything else possible. What changed me was a series of quiet human moments. A public defender who saw me when I couldn't see myself. A mother whose love was more patient than my self-destruction. A man named Dennis who treated my potential as a fact rather than a possibility. And a 10-year-old boy who needed someone to show up for him, the way no one had yet shown up for me. I now work full-time at that same rec center. Jordan is 15 now, and last month he told me he wants to be an engineer. I told him that was the best thing I'd heard all year, and then I went into the supply closet and stood there for a moment because my eyes were doing something embarrassing and I needed a minute. If this story reached something inside you, if you've ever been the person in the handcuffs, or the person waiting on the courthouse steps, or the child wearing loneliness like a coat, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. You never know whose life a single story can quietly save. Sharing it is an act of kindness, and kindness, as it turns out, is one of the most radical things a person can do. Before we reach the end, I want to ask you something personal. Drop a comment below and tell me, what is one moment in your life that cracked you open and helped you become someone better? I read every single one, and your words matter more than you know. I am not a finished story. None of us are, but I am a different chapter than the one I was living the night those handcuffs closed around my wrists, and every morning I wake up and choose, imperfectly, stubbornly, gratefully, on to keep writing forward. The arrest didn't save me, but it stopped me long enough for saving to become possible. And sometimes, that's all a second chance really is. Not a gift handed to you whole, but a pause in the falling, long enough for you to remember that you still have hands, and that hands were made for building. The most important story you will ever tell is the one you tell yourself about who you still have the chance to become.